Hi, everybody. It's Sue and Sal. We're back again for week 4 of our Winter Victory Garden video series, Conversations with Backyard Gardeners. This week, we're going to be talking with our experienced gardeners about things like growing in containers, using organic practices, and also mistakes that people have made and learned from or not learned from. So without further ado, let's check it out.
Just talking about like some strategies for growing. Do you prefer to start all of your seeds inside? Do you buy your pre-started plants from nurseries, or is it kind of a mix of those two?
So I like to start our warm loving crops inside. So that would be like the tomatoes and the peppers. I don't like to start squash ahead of time. I feel like it has very delicate roots and doesn't really like to be transplanted. And they usually only get like 1 or 2 weeks ahead of schedule anyways by planting them in transplant pots ahead of time. And then any seeds that are like cool loving, I like to direct seed. So radishes, lettuces, things like that. Carrots, where it's easier to thin once they've been sprouted. And other than that, I'd say crops where I know that there's going to be, I want them to be around for the whole season and I want them to get a really strong start. I'll start those ahead of time. My kale and my collards that I pick off from the whole season, I'll start those ahead of time just to give them a head start against the weed competition and so they have a chance to get really well established.
I usually start most of my things from seed. So I'll usually order all my seeds and then I'll grow them in little tiny pots. And then I'll plant them out or I'll direct seed. And so I usually don't buy from local nurseries for the most part.
I have a little tiny greenhouse that I do start some things in there. And I don't use like little pots. I start in the ground and then I just dig them to transplant. They seem to do better that way. Tomatoes and peppers, I start with some marigolds always, and I like squash and watermelon, all that stuff. I plant just seeds. I don't start them ahead of time. To me, it seems like they're set back so much by the time I get them in the ground that it doesn't really make a difference.
Mostly direct seeding. I do start tomatoes inside. I have started onions inside. They're grow lights, and it's a challenge because, of course, I never quite have enough for the right setup. So things tend to get a little leggier than ideal. But I always have lots of tomatoes, so I mean it works.
So when you grow your plants, do you do a lot more growing in just in-ground rows? Do you like to use raised beds and or container gardens?
Well, I've tried it all. So I kind of mix it up. So in raised beds, I did that a number of years ago, and it's nice as far as you can sit on it and weed, and you don't have to rototill it because the soil doesn't get packed down and stuff. That's nice. The bad thing is it gets a lot drier, and my soil is very sandy and gravelly, so it dries out really fast. So that's the downside of the raised beds. So I do a variety.
So last year we actually had a really great balcony garden where we grew a lot of our herbs that we could just walk out and pick, like thyme and oregano, rosemary, basil. So when we're making pizzas or roasting something, it would be great to just walk out to the balcony. We also had a cherry tomato plant out there. So that was sort of our balcony container garden. And in the garden itself, I like to plant, I don't till anymore, especially not with this small of a garden, but I use like a potato fork or a broad fork to loosen the soil and sort of rake them up so that they get more water drainage and just nice, loose, like not compacted soil. It's not very intuitive until I guess you can see the difference between compacted soil and not compacted soil. The plants that are grown just direct into soil that's very compacted just seem very like weak and unable to produce. So yeah, I think that's a really important step.
I do a lot of raised bed gardening, and our soil here is very hard, a lot of rock, a lot of clay. And so when I first started gardening, I dug a hole and I filled it with really good dirt. And then I planted in there, and I had like these little bonsai miniature plants because the roots would grow to the end of the bowl and they would stop because the rock hard soil wouldn't let the roots go any further. So I then the following year realized I had to make a much larger planting container for those plants. So I do a lot of raised beds using wood. Some of them have nothing on each sides to hold the dirt in. It's just a mounded system. And then some of them are rock, like field rock from local fields that have been cleared for crops.
We have raised beds now, and that's worked out well. In our case, it was just to get better soil available to us, rather than moving into a new house a couple of years ago, and the side yard just wasn't really garden ready. So this just allowed us to get a jump start on, years of amending the soil.
You had beds built and then you had them filled with a mixture
Yeah,
of
exactly.
compost and soil, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Plus that does give you at least like a 18-inch jump on your rabbit fencing, because in addition to deer, there's a bazillion rabbits around here. So that's at least the start of keeping the rabbits out.
I have grown in straw bales, and I did that because I was unable to move my squash around far enough to avoid squash beetles that got worse over a period of a couple years. So I took the straw bales and put them on top of the soil where I usually planted the squash, and planted my squash in the straw bales, hoping that that would be sufficient to alleviate the problem with the squash bugs. And it was actually, yeah.
Good tip. So you actually took like the whole bale
Yes,
and plopped it down, and then planted your plant up in the top.
yes. It was hard to keep it watered.
Oh,
So that's why I don't usually do it. And I have tried growing tomatoes and other plants in pots up on the deck, but I think the deck gets too hot, so I haven't had a whole lot of success with that. I did have success this fall though. I had some kale plants that were still beautiful, but they were in the way of trying to get the garden ready for winter. So I dug them up and I threw them in some buckets and put them on my deck, and they're still very beautiful, and I'm eating off of them, a month later. So
in the fall, I dig up a rosemary and a couple parsley plants, and I bring those in. So that kind of pot gardening I do. I just planted the other day, I was sorting through my onions and some are starting to sprout. So I went down to the greenhouse and got a pot of dirt, and you stick an onion in there, and then it'll shoot up greens, and you can have fresh onion tops till they get exhausted, and works great.
do you use any organic practices, or what is your philosophy on that?
Yeah, I don't use any herbicides or pesticides or anything. I do mulch with straw, and it's not an organic straw. I found a guy that makes those great big square bales of wheat straw, and it's really clean and really, it's chopped. So to spread it in the garden is just a dream, and it breaks down really quickly. Otherwise, I get manure from people I know. I don't use chemical fertilizers. I don't do any of that stuff.
Yeah, everything I grow is grown organically. So you and I have talked about this before, but cabbage loopers are just a very consistent problem. I don't mind eating things that have holes in them. I do kind of mind when I find out that I've eaten the cabbage looper. So I'll try and closely inspect. That's just like just an expected thing when you're growing organically, is that there's going to be bugs on your produce. So just look at it very carefully, wash it, and You know, there's actually been studies that plants that have been attacked by pests actually produce more antioxidants. So they produce antioxidants in response to that stress, and we can take in those extra antioxidants. So it's actually healthier for us to eat plants that have gone under a period of stress.
Well, it has to be organic, because the first year I gardened, I found out the big mistake with not having organic gardening, because I didn't really know about gardening. So the first year I started putting my stuff in, and I was reading the books of gardening that you get from the library. And of course, when you get this bug or that bug, they'd say, oh, go get some 7 or go get this or that to kill it. So I went in, marched in, got some of this stuff, and it was horrible. It was like you'd spray it and it would kill everything. And then the stuff would come back, and I came across an organic gardening magazine, and it was like, it all made so much sense. Once I started doing that, I had much, much better gardens. You know, all of a sudden everything kind of fit together with doing it that way. And sustainable, yeah, because I've gotten more and more interested. You know, I've been, as I study and read and stuff, I'm learning more about how everything works together. And so I want my gardening to benefit all creatures.
I do use organic methods, which is why I want to move my plants around to avoid pests that can congregate after a couple of years of the dead foliage in one spot, you know, insects.
I guess I don't really do anything that I know of that's not organic. It's a little bit of that. There's just not a whole lot that I feel like I need to do that wouldn't just be organic. I don't tend to fertilize much of at all. So I don't have too many pest problems. So I haven't really had to deal with that kind of thing.
Do you add compost?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely the soil that we have in the garden beds is relatively new and came with a lot of compost in it. I have actually been more than ever before successfully doing that kind of black backyard rolling bin composting system, and I've been dumping that in, and that's worked out pretty well. I finally read the instructions that said make sure you add some carbon along with all your nitrogen, and magically it works. So I've been throwing in like leaves and sawdust and paper towels and other kind of carbonaceous things to go with all of the plant material, and suddenly it's actually composting like they tell you it will if you read the instructions.
I shoot to be organic. You know, I do believe the world we live on, it's one world, one earth, and if we put chemicals in it, you know, we're going to be eating those chemicals. And you know, one little piece of chemical may not be much, but if everybody put that one little piece of whatever that chemical is out there, and I do it, and then my children do it, and over the years, it's going to build up and it's going to impact us all. And so for me, gardening with sort of the least hazardous method is really the way to go, you know, because we all share the same planet.
What is a gardening mistake that taught you a lot?
I'd say one of the hardest things to learn was spacing. And it's really hard to rein it in when you have, like, let's say you go to the greenhouse and you get a six pack of tomatoes, and you really want to put them all into this like one planter you have, and they just don't grow, or you forget to thin your carrots and you end up with no carrots. So pay really close attention to the planting spacing from your seed company, or however you get that information. You can do a quick online search, like what is the spacing for a zucchini plant, and make sure that you give it enough space, because really when they're too close together, there's not enough airflow. They can get diseases like powdery mildew a lot easier when they're too close together, and they just don't produce as much. They're not as happy. So just give them the space. Giving them the space that they need is like one of the most consistent mistakes I've made in the garden.
Oh, some of the things I've mulched with have been ridiculous. Put plastic mulch under this area where we put, you know, chips and things on there, and that's just a pain, because put the plastic stuff down and all it does is after a couple seasons it makes this beautiful layer of nice like compost, but then it doesn't do any good, because then you have to rip everything up, and then all the things that have grown grow right through the plastic. It's no. Oh yeah, I've made this beautiful thing. One year I have, like I said, a lot of rocks here. So I got all these flat rocks that were beautiful and made this lovely walkway through the garden, kind of like a curvy one. And it was really pretty, except for being an organic gardener. You have to just constantly be weeding, because of course everything comes up through the rocks, and then it's kind of not as easy to walk on. And so it was pretty, but finally it had to get pulled up. You can put rocks in some place, not where you're going to be walking a lot, and then put things in between the rocks that are like pretty, like creeping time. It'll take over all the rocks if you give it a chance.
Taking on too much,
Mm.
making things, trying to do a bigger garden than what I could handle, or planting, like trying to plant all too many kinds of things, and I couldn't take care of it all.
Yeah.
It's really taken me a long time to kind of rein all that in. Because it is fun to try new things, but to figure out what actually works and then focus on that and really make sure that my garden's productive. And I enjoy it a lot more when it is productive and not chaotic.
Unfortunately, I have not learned as much from my gardening mistakes as I should, because I tend to repeat them. But I would say that kind of what we discussed earlier about watering has been pretty interesting. I kind of, these things like you shouldn't even need odd experiences to like learn things from them. But I've always grown garlic. I planted a bunch of garlic. I've always like put it over here in one side of the bed, because it's just going to sit there for from the fall until the following midsummer. And one year it just happened to be near where I had been planted a bunch of spring greens. So I was like watering them a lot and just sort of almost collaterally watering the garlic. And suddenly I had like the best garlic ever. It's just like, oh, yeah, I guess even though garlic kind of takes care of itself, it still needs water.
Yeah.
I am promising myself this year that I'm going to revisit all of my mistakes, primarily around watering and thinning and just not overcrowding in the first place, and just see whether or not I can improve some things that I tend not to do.
Plant my stuff too close. I can always fit one more thing in here, and I can plant one more thing in there, and it's like they're going to do better if you give them more room, but it's like, no, I need more plants. That's the thing I do. And I don't prune as much as I should. Like I always just feel like I'm hurting the plants, but they do better if you give them some more pruning.
Overgrown zucchini is definitely one. Like this year, I'm not gonna let a single zucchini get too big, is one that I still have not accomplished. They've tricked me every single year. And paying attention to the first frost. I feel like even though we're looking at the weather every day and paying close attention to it, it still somehow always catches me by surprise. And there's always like this last minute flurry to cover plants and harvest. And it's always just a rush. And I wish it wasn't, but it ends up that way every year. Gardening is just mistake after mistake and triumph after triumph. It's ongoing roller coaster of success and failure.
I bite off more than I can chew every year. I look at those seed catalogs. I look at the tree catalogs, and I think, oh, I can do that, and I'll grow more. I'll try more than I really have the energy for. Biting off more than I can chew, I'd say, is probably the biggest mistake, but it's also, in some ways, the biggest reward. And the reason being, I think we grow the most as people when we push ourselves. And as gardeners, I think, in anything, you want to push yourself. You want to grow from it and try things and learn. And it's by trying new varieties, by putting in too many tomato plants where there's no way you would ever go through those tomatoes. It's one of those things that you grow from, you learn from, and next year, maybe not too many tomatoes, maybe it'll be too many pepper plants next year, right? It's one of those things where it's an ongoing process that you never want to end.
Well, I have to say that I really like Steve's perspective there. I think it helps a little bit now we're in the winter to look back and maybe see our mistakes not as these terrible mistakes, but these are opportunities to learn from. And, like Ted said, that, this year it's going to be better. We're going to find those mistakes and we're going to, keep improving, and maybe we'll make different mistakes, but, there's a lot to learn from every year.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like it's one of the things I really love about gardening is that there are always things to learn. And so it never gets boring. And it's from those mistakes that we learn new things, or from, trying new things. So I could really relate to so many people expressing that in this video. That was good to hear.
Right. And we are learning from our mistakes, but there's also so many things left to learn just from other gardeners, or, learn as we go on. So listening to, some of the gardeners talk about some of their strategies for growing, I think I, learned a few tips, or I took some new ideas on. I love the idea of digging up a kale plant at the end of the year, or, just digging up a few herb plants, putting them in pots and just trying to extend the, life of the plants. So I thought that was a really great idea that I think I'd like to try this year.
Yeah, I agree. And also the thought of taking a sprouted onion that normally you might just throw away or throw in the compost, and sticking it in a pot of dirt and then eating the greens. Like that never occurred to me, and it's just such a great idea. So that's one I'm going to try for sure. One of the other things that I really thought was interesting was how many people talked about using organic growing techniques, um, and just kind of the different perspectives on why people were growing organically.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of, some people don't even do it intentionally. They're just pointing out that it makes sense. It's easy. There's no real, it's easy to rotate my crops, or, have really healthy soil and put compost into it. And there's just not really a need to grow using other methods. And, though they mentioned maybe, you can't be certified organic, like who's really worried about that? In our backyards, we just want to grow the best food that we can.
Yeah, for some people, it seemed to be much more of a philosophical decision. And like you said, for other people, it was more just kind of a practical decision. So that was interesting. Sal, another thing I noticed, several people mentioning the importance of soil not being too compacted. So that was just an interesting thing to note. Haley mentioning using the broad fork, and it seemed like quite a few people mentioned the loose soil as being important for the roots of the plants to get well established. So I feel like I've just it's so interesting to hear like the common things that people bring up, and then also people's different ways of actually going about their gardening, and just the commonalities and the differences are just super interesting to note.
Right, right. It's all, there's so many different unique ways that it seems like people are finding to garden. Even just listening to how everybody's growing their gardens. So it seems like a lot of people are maybe avoiding that soil compaction or working on their soil health through raised beds, but then they're also dabbling maybe a little bit in ground, maybe a little bit in containers. So it's just showing that, there's a million iterations of how you can grow a garden. So thanks for joining us again this week. We've got one more week of the winter video series that'll be premiering in 2 weeks. So we hope you'll join us for that one. And as always, we are totally funded by viewers like you. So if you want to send a little donation, help us keep producing videos like this, you can head over to FarmTable's website at farmtablefoundation.org. Click the donate tab on top and make a donation. Any amount, big or small, will help us keep doing these videos that we love. We will link to last summer's full Victory Garden series in case you want to check that out and get ready for this next season. and subscribe if you haven't already. That's a great way to show your support for us. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everybody.